Hi, welcome to World Maker Books. I'm Joy, and we're going to continue with the reading of Black and White by Mark Wandrey. We are in Part 2, Chapters 15 through 17 will be today's reading. Chapter 15, Lupasha Independent Trading Station, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm, December 13th, 2037. Placed on an effectively free approach course to Lupasha's space station, Teddy Roosevelt, Kaval Tesh, and Kaval Otto drifted silently through space. Captain Baker remarked that Second Octal had released them so efficiently she wouldn't have to use her engines to do anything except slow upon approach. Only a single ship stopped in the Lupasha system with them, a tanker many times larger than the 3 ships from Earth. It was already firing its engines to slow down and park around the approaching station, which left the other 3 ships effectively alone on their approach. Terry stopped off in the observation dome several times over the following day, enjoying the view of the approaching station. He'd found visiting stations in other systems was something to look forward to. He'd seen Earth's tiny orbiting stations many times on TV and Tri-V. Then the massive triple rings of Karma Station showed him what was possible. He was filled with excitement as they fell toward Lupasha 2 and its orbiting station. The planet Lupasha 2 was visible almost immediately, a mottled white-brown dot which grew hourly. When the ring of a space station became visible, the planet was still quite small. Terry remembered the captain had described it as a dwarf planet like Pluto. A dwarf planet was often smaller than many other planets' moons. Of course, he wasn't looking forward to seeing the planet. The station came into focus. "Wow," he said as he used a small telescope to examine the station. "Pathetic." The station visible in the telescope was a sad echo of the massive Karma Station. It was obviously meant to be a similar design, only it had never been completed. The stationary hub in the center sported 4 spokes radiating out to a single completed ring. The framework of 2 more rings were in place between the hub and the one completed ring, almost resembling ghosts of what might have been. The 3 ships spun around and used their engines to gradually slow until they were only a kilometer away from the half-built station, and then stopped in relation to it. It was big compared to their ships, but nowhere near as big as Karma Station. Terry met up with his mom, Doc, and the other 6 mercs of Last Call in one of Teddy Roosevelt's shuttles for the short ride over to the grandiosely named Lupasha Independent Trading Station. It was a surprisingly quiet ride, for many reasons. The mercs looked intent and businesslike. His mom looked concerned. Terry realized this was the end of the line. Lupasha was his new home for the indefinite future. The inside of the station proved to be as slapdash as the exterior. There were no glideways like on Karma Station. Instead, there was a cluster of 6 traditional lifts in each spoke of the hub. Everyone in their party fit into the lift for their 5-minute ride. As gravity slowly climbed, they passed through what would have been stations on the 2 rings. Instead, they were merely long enclosed sections with nothing to see. It was a little sad. Arriving at the ring with its half-gravity, also less than Karma Station, Terry saw ample room for untold businesses existed in the promenade, yet most were empty, having never been completed. They were merely holes in the walls with nothing inside. Some played host to what could only be homeless families. Seeing one of the biggest problems humans seemed unable to eradicate among aliens thousands of light years from home was a shock to him. "Are they homeless?" Terry asked. "Well, they don't have any way to leave," Doc confirmed. "We ran across them in a few places during contracts," Tina told him. "Usually they're refugees from fighting. These are financial casualties." "What do you mean?" he asked. "Left here after the Selroth bailed and the Islians gave up," Doc said. "Isn't there any way they can get help?" Terry wondered. A big family of El Shah watched him dispassionately from their dilapidated surroundings. They were cooking food on an improvised electrical grill, which looked like it was made from a lighting fixture. "The universe isn't a fair place," Doc said. Terry frowned. He'd heard Doc utter those words before, and he hadn't liked it then. The other Last Call mercs grunted in agreement, except Tina, who was watching Terry. "It bothers you?" she asked. He nodded. "Bothers me, too," his mom agreed. "Maybe if we do well on Hoarfrost, things will get better for them here," she suggested. "How?" Terry wondered. "Prosperity has a way of spreading. Most of these aliens came here for work. If we do well, there will be more work." "How many of them are there?" he wondered. "Here?" Tina asked. He nodded. "Probably a few thousand at least. Beings in this situation in the galaxy, I wouldn't be surprised if 1,000,000 starved to death every day." "Maybe if the Union didn't ignore them, less would starve," his mom said. Terry found himself nodding in agreement. "Sorry to say it's probably the opposite," Doc said. "They spent hundreds of trillions on Earth in handouts, and poverty stayed exactly the same or got even worse. Places where industry grew and businesses flourished, poverty decreased, usually precipitously. People still starve in places with lots of businesses, she said mulishly. And they always will, Doc replied. Terry could see his mom's jaw muscles bunching and knew she was struggling with herself. The group of humans moved through the station based on directions Doc and his people had obtained on their previous visit. The destination was a leasing office that appeared almost as dingy as the station itself. A bored-looking boomer was perched by a series of mounted slates, looking as worn out as the station. The office smelled like a birdcage in dire need of cleaning. The alien's owl-like head turned to notice them as they stopped in the entrance. The boomer chirped and clicked. "You looking for something?" came out of Terry's translator. "A ship," Doc said. He'd set his own translator into active mode, so it replied in the boomer's own language. It was a useful feature, as few aliens had English matrices in their own translators. "Oh," the boomer chirped in surprise. It spent a minute shuffling computers and chips before looking back at Doc. "What are you in need of?" Doc spent a minute detailing their requirements, which were considerable. Besides being able to temporarily house the 10 orcas and 19 bottlenose dolphins, it had to have landing-capable small craft able to set down on a planet that couldn't refuel them. "Not asking for much, are you?" the boomer said. The translator managed to convey scorn. "It's what we need. Can you do it? How are you paying?" Doc flashed a pair of 100,000 credit chits. "Won't be enough." "We have more." The boomer's beak worked and huge eyes blinked. Terry guessed it was thinking about the possibilities. "How much more?" The other 6 mercs moved into view of the boomer, who seemed surprised to notice them. None of them acted threatening in any way, yet they all carried weapons and wore armor. "Enough," Doc said. "Can you help us or not?" "It's funny you ask," the boomer said in an unfunny way. "I got a message sometime back requesting similar capacity." "Interesting," Doc said dryly. Of course, he'd probably inquired before returning to Karma and getting the ball rolling. "You still haven't answered my question." Terry was amazed he could be so cool about everything. If they couldn't find a way to move down to the planet, they were in big trouble. He'd heard the ships already had jobs elsewhere and needed to leave within 2 weeks. Even if they could be convinced to take their passengers and cargo back to Karma, the warships might still be waiting. Worse, there could be more of them by then. Going back wasn't an option. "There's a heavy lift transport available," the boomer said. 2 orbital-class landers as well. "Wonderful," Doc said. "We'd like to contract them." "The ship isn't hyperspace capable," the boomer explained. "Noted." The boomer's huge eyes regarded Doc, then went over everyone else, lingering curiously for a fraction of a second on Terry before returning to Doc. "How long do you need these assets?" 4 weeks will be sufficient." Now the boomer's curiosity was obviously piqued. Its big head tilted almost 90 degrees. It took everything Terry had not to laugh. "The only ship capable of carrying the transports left the system a day ago." "How about you leave the details up to us?" Doc said. "Will you arrange the lease or not?" The boomer tapped at his slate idly for a moment, staring at Doc without saying anything. "Okay, let's look elsewhere." "Nobody here on the station has the ships you want," the boomer snapped, clicking its beak angrily. Doc shrugged. With enough credits or firepower, anything is possible. His mercs stared the boomer down, and it ruffled its feathers and relented. "Rate is 300,000 credits for 1 month, it said. A 1 million credit damage retainer is necessary." "Fine," Doc said. The boomer blinked twice and watched in amazement as Doc began producing more 100,000 credit chits. "Lots more. I want the contract in hard copy, and I'm affixing my mercenary guild license to the contract." "You didn't say this was for mercenary work," the boomer howled in outrage. "You didn't ask." 10 days is cutting it dangerously close," Terry's mom said as they walked back to the shuttle bay. "Captain Baker said her next job is nowhere near Earth. If this doesn't work out—" "What?" Doc asked. "We'll be worse off than here?" He gestured at the dilapidated interior of the station's promenade. "He wouldn't dare fail to provide those ships now," Honcho said in a rare moment of speech. "Why?" she demanded. "When Doc put our merc registration on the contract, he upped the ante," Honcho explained. "Old Hooter there doesn't come through, we can go to the Merc Guild." "Better," Tina said. "We can take it out of his hide." Her grin was feral, as if she were hoping that situation would occur. "Would beating him up get us down to the moon?" Terry's mom asked. "It wouldn't, but it would be fun." "Do you want to look around some more?" Doc asked Terry. "No," he said. They were passing the Elshaw family, who were again watching the humans go by. "Let's get out of here." "Sure," Doc said. "Wait," Terry said suddenly, and walked over to the family's home. The 2 adult reptilians watched him warily with both their independent eye turrets. Terry stopped at the edge of their space. 2 of the young were hanging from the faded and dingy ceiling, also watching him. Terry didn't know much about Elshaw, but he thought he knew hopelessness when he saw it. He reached into his pocket and took a credit chit, sitting it on the floor just inside their door. One of the two adults, he couldn't tell if it was male or female, came closer, one eye darting to the credit chit and then back to Terry. "Go ahead," he said. "I hope it helps." The alien stepped over and picked up the chit, which was 100 credits in denomination. It examined it for a moment, then placed it in a pouch. "I thank you," the alien said, and bowed its head. Terry nodded and rejoined the others. His mom put an arm around his shoulder and gave him an affectionate squeeze. "Why did you bother?" Tina asked. "It probably won't help them get out of here." "Maybe not," Terry said, "but it was fun." Doc glanced at him, and Terry winked at him. Tina cursed mildly, and they continued to the lift back down to the hub. Behind them, the Elshaw and its family watched them go in silence. Chapter 16. Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Horo Region, Toloarm, December 24th, 2037. Lander 1 rode its descent motors like blazing pillars of hydrogen fire into Hoarfrost's atmosphere. The pilot, a huge snail-like creature with 3 eyes, called a Bakulu, managed the craft via pinplants. When he'd come forward after checking on Pokale, he'd marveled at the alien sitting glued to the pilot's area. The only discernible movement was its eyes, looking at 3 different displays at the same time while controlling the ship with its mind alone. "Is it difficult?" Terry asked the Bakulu. "Not at all," it replied. Terry's translator spoke in English, but for the life of him he couldn't detect any sign the alien pilot had uttered a single word. "It takes only a tiny portion of my brain to operate the craft." One of its eyes rose over the huge pearlescent shell to regard Terry. "My species prefers serving in space. We are naturals in this environment. Most of our race is born in space these days. This merely enhances our natural proclivity to this environment." "Living in space doesn't cause any physiological difficulties?" Terry's mom asked from behind them. "No," the Bakulu responded. "Why would it?" The transport used a combination of atmospheric resistance and engines to slow its descent, breaking through scattered cloud cover and skimming over the endless expanse of icy mountains. The surface looked like the Swiss Alps, made entirely of ice. The shattered ramparts towered kilometers into the sky in places. Without warning, the broken mountains gave way to a vast plain extending for many kilometers below them. Terry looked out of the extra-large transport cockpit to try to get a feel for the plain. It didn't look natural. "This is weird," he said, and pointed at the graceful curve of the plane. "It looks the way it should," Doc said from the rear of the seating area. "It was created with orbital laser cannons." "Holy cow," Terry said, glancing back at Doc. "Lasers?" "Yup," he said. "Remember, the Islians were in charge of this project." He pointed up. Above them, through the crystal-clear cockpit, Lupasha 1 arced from horizon to horizon in swirling yellow-orange splendor. A line cut across the view, the plane of the great gas giant's ring just below Hoarfrost's orbit. "Why did they do it?" "The ice below is 2 kilometers thick," Doc explained. "Ice of the sort you find on planets like this is more akin to rock, as I understand it. After the survey was complete, they parked a battle cruiser in orbit and set to work." "How long did it take?" "I don't know," Doc admitted. "Depends on the ship, I guess. Lasers vary from 10 megawatt to a gigawatt on warships. It could have had a couple or a dozen. To answer your question, anywhere from a couple hours to days, I guess." Terry tried to imagine a big alien spaceship in orbit, bristling with laser weapons, blazing away at the icy moon like in a sci-fi film, attacking the surface of the world as if it were an enemy armada. Looking out over the nearly flat ice field, he had a hard time imagining why. "So, why?" he eventually asked. "Like I said, the ice was practically rock. When it gets that thick, the thermal transfer rates are tricky." "True," Dr. Hernandez chimed in from the rear of the passenger area. "They used the lasers to break up the super hard ice and alter it to a more favorable form." "Favorable to what?" "Getting through," Doc said. He pointed out of the cockpit, and Terry could see the first artificial structures on the planet. They were perched on the edge of the first liquid water he'd seen. "You've never explained where we're going to live here," Terry said, and looked back at his mother. The landscape outside was dim, almost like twilight back on Earth. They were now only a kilometer above the ice, and he could see the laser-created plain wasn't as flat as he'd thought. It, too, was a cracked mess of many hills. It looked like the ice fields in Antarctica they'd studied in school, where the icebergs were born. "Are we living in those buildings?" "They're automated," his mom explained. "They're fusion power plants and big heat sinks." "I don't understand." She looked uncomfortable when she continued. "The power plant provides power to the mining and habitat facilities. Instead of dumping excess heat into the atmosphere, they dump it into the water you see via specialized heat exchangers. The exchangers heat the water and keep it liquid at the cost of 100 megawatts constant output. But why are they doing it? He asked, feeling frustrated. Because it maintains a 19-kilometer cylinder of liquid water, Doc said, which is the only access to the habitat and mining facilities. Terry's brow furrowed as he tried to put the statement into context. Below them, the facilities were coming into better view. A huge power plant, like the fusion plants being built on Earth, dominated the largest part. He'd been wrong. The facility wasn't built on the ice. It was floating at the edge of a roughly circular lake of water. On the edge of the floating buildings was a ring of large landing pads and blocky structures. Nowhere for people to live and no sign of vehicles. Under 2 kilometers of ice, he finally realized. We're living under the ice? He asked, hoping he'd misunderstood. Yes, his mother said. Terry looked horrified. Before you freak out, think about it. How is that so different from living in a spaceship, which you've been doing for almost 7 months? It's very different, Mom, he said. It's different for the cetaceans, too, she retorted, which brought him up short. We're here because of them. For good or ill, all this has transpired for their welfare. We've been trying for half a year to find a place for them to live. This is the best we can do. I've been all over this arm of the galaxy, Doc said. There are a few better planets, maybe, but they're all colonized and would be problematic for us. This planet's ecology and ocean's chemical structure is almost ideal, Dr. Janig said. The senior staff had been listening in the back of the passenger area. We've been giving the cetaceans a drug therapy treatment designed to get them acclimated to the planet's ocean. That's why you built the submersible, Terry said, looking at Doc. Doc nodded. The man was watching him closely, the ever-present appraisal stare Terry had seen him use so many times. What's the long-term plan? Terry asked. He could tell by her expression his mother was caught off guard by the question. We get the cetaceans established, try to find a way for them to care for themselves in this environment, and if it works out, we consider going home to face the music. Won't they know where you've taken the cetaceans? Unlikely, Doc said. We used cash for everything, including these ships. The ships the winged hussars loaned us won't tell anybody where they went after Karma, Colonel Kosmalski assured us. As far as the rest of the universe is concerned, we simply disappeared. Terry thought of baby Pokale. What would happen to him if they were forced to return to Earth or were captured and brought back forcibly? Would he be killed like the adults, or end up in a sideshow, child of the whale freaks? Then we'll figure out how to make it work, he said. His mom smiled and hugged him. I'm glad you're on board, she said. You're our IT expert, you know. He snorted but smiled. I'm learning, he said. And we want you to keep learning, Dr. Janig said. I'll need some expertise if we're to implant the devices into Pokale. You've decided then? Terry asked, excited now. We were still considering, the doctor admitted. It was Moloko who decided for us. She asked when her calf would get the implants. We said we were waiting to discuss it with her. She said the pod had agreed it would be good to do so sooner rather than later. Surprisingly forward-thinking for the Orcas, Dr. Orsage said. I've noticed as time has gone by, they're increasingly analytical in their thinking. She looked at Terry and pointed at him. We need to learn more about these pin plants so we can better understand their effects. We're depending on you, young man. I will, Terry said. Despite being only 12 years old, he felt 12 feet tall. Prepare for landing, the Bakulu pilot's voice said through their translators, as the transport began a slow turn and started its landing sequence. It took 2 trips of the lighter transports to bring down all the staff and their dependents. Terry had forgotten how many of them there were. He did his classes remotely because of other responsibilities, and he usually ate with his mom or Doc, and sometimes the other Mercs. The small topside station, designed mainly for maintenance and providing just a few cots and assembly areas, was jam-packed with over 100 people. The buildings next to the landing pads were stores, warehouses, and submarine pens. In the latter were their way to get down to their new homes. The cetaceans had been undergoing pressure acclimation for the last 2 days. The only one who wouldn't immediately be ready to dive down was Pokale, who couldn't be separated from Terry yet due to feeding requirements. The surface temperature was cold, deadly cold. An unprotected human would be instantly incapacitated. Their eyes would freeze in a fraction of a second, skin in another second. They would be dead in under a minute. It was only 5 degrees Kelvin above the temperature of liquid nitrogen. They all wore protective suits, like spacesuits, but without the need to compensate for vacuum. Tina called them hot pockets. Having to spend a couple of minutes getting into a spacesuit for a 1-minute walk from the landing transport to a building seemed like a waste of time, at least until he got into one and went outside. The suit's incredibly powerful heaters made it feel like he was in a rotisserie oven the second he turned them on. Do not turn off the heaters, Doc warned them. He and his last call mercs were escorting them in groups of 10, as they only had 20 suits and were keeping a few in reserve. If you get a red light on your suit heaters, yell out immediately. You'll only have a few seconds before frostbite sets in. Will Pokale be okay? Terry asked. He'll be warmer than we are. Ready? Everyone nodded. Even through the visors, Terry could see everyone's eyes wide with concern. He thought he probably looked the same. Despite the searing heat from the suit, he bit his lips and waited as the lock cycled. A second later, it opened and the cold hit them. Terry had been skiing a couple times on Mauna Kea during the winter. He remembered how cold he'd been after several hours in the snow. It seemed to seep into his very bones. That was exactly how he felt after just a couple of seconds of hoarfrost cold. He coughed and gasped from the impact, and his suit instantly went to full power. He hadn't realized the heater wasn't on 100%. He guessed full power outside the cold of hoarfrost might have been as dangerous from the suit as it would be from the cold. As it was, the heaters pushed back the deadly chill to only a numbing cold. They were all jogging by the time they ran into the building and through the double doors. Doc patted him on the back. Good job. This is insane, he said to the Merc. Doc laughed in reply. Young man, this isn't even winter here. Wait until we're behind Lupasha 1 for a week and no sun reaches the moon. Pools of liquid nitrogen form, and the fusion plant can't keep the ice clear. I didn't think I'd be this excited to dive down 2 kilometers underwater, Terry admitted. Soon, Doc said. Soon. Once all the people were down and safe in the buildings, landing the cetaceans could begin. Terry watched through the building's heated glass and a video feed underwater as the heavy transport landed directly in the water. The cargo door opened and out came the first 5 orcas. He recognized them as Wandering Pod. The 5 sleek black and white orcas shot out of the cargo hold of the transport in a flurry of flashing flukes, which could only be described as pure joy. Around and around they circled each other, bumping and rubbing, rolling on their sides and looking up at the surface. Aren't they in danger? Terry asked. The cold. The water is around -10 degrees Celsius, he said, and smiled. Not too cold for an orca, from what I hear. Terry nodded. That was true, of course. The water at the Institute was kept at -2 degrees, not because it was ideal, but because it was expensive to refrigerate it. The water in the ship had been held at 0 Celsius. The Arctic seawater could get considerably colder. The orcas were ecstatic. He wondered what they would do. They'd been in captivity all their lives. None of their whales had ever been in the wild before. Would they run, or do something crazy? Instead, after their celebration, they simply waited. A few minutes later, the other transport landed in the water again. This was the one that had brought the humans down. It opened its ramp just below the surface, and the bottlenoses shot out. It was like watching a machine gun firing dolphins. The ramp was narrow enough they were forced to go single file. Even so, all 19 were in the water in less than a minute. Unlike the orcas, they didn't spend their exuberance quickly. When the final big transport landed 15 minutes later, they were still racing around each other, around the orcas, and playing with half-submerged pieces of ice. The doors opened on the last transport, and the 5 orcas of the new superpod raced out to join the others. It was the first time all 9 adult orcas were together. Terry saw Dr. Osage watching, and, of course, taking notes. The orcas swam next to each other, touching fins and brushing against each other. Then, almost before he realized it, 2 were fighting. What do we do? He barked in surprise. Nothing, his mom said. We were expecting this, Dr. Osage said. They're deciding who's in charge. Terry looked closer at the video image to try to figure out who was fighting. He thought it was Ki'i and Cray, the biggest males of each pod. Before he could be sure, it was over. Then he was sure it was the 2 he'd guessed when they swam side by side past the camera. Cray was in the lead, and Ki'i had a line of dark rakes down one side. Is he okay? Terry asked. Dr. Janig examined the footage. Yes, it isn't serious. Common in wild orcas. Nothing more than a minor argument. Terry looked at the deep gouges, which were bleeding, and shook his head. He hoped they never had a serious argument. There might only be 1 pod now, Dr. Osage said, then shrugged. We'll find out when we meet them down at the habitat. Almost as if they'd been listening, all 9 orcas formed into a line and slowly began spiraling down into the dark, dark depths. Thin lines of bubbles trailed from their rebreather domes and were soon gone from view, leaving no evidence they were ever there. As had been arranged, they would spend the next 36 hours slowly diving down the 2 kilometers to the habitat. It would give their bodies the time they needed to acclimate to the intense pressure. The people left the gathering area and moved down a hall into a cavernous hangar. Inside were 3 cylindrical submersibles, each surfaced in a berth. Terry saw some of the staff were already removing cables and climbing inside. Soon lights came on as the vehicles came to life. Many in their entourage looked at the craft with mixed feelings. The younger children crowded around their parents. The older ones, like Terry, tried to look brave. His mom and Doc led him to the closest one. People were loading what gear they could aboard. Most of the non-passenger space was being used by the module that held Pokale, a long cylindrical container on wheels. The calf was asleep from a mild tranquilizer. Not much extra room would be available with so many people to transport down. The staff designated as pilots for the submersibles would take them back up after everyone was down and bring down gear the transports had gone back to space to get. Honcho from Doc's team was driving their sub. They'd all said their goodbyes to the captains and crew of Teddy Roosevelt, Kaval Tesh, and Kaval Otto. As soon as the last load of equipment was offloaded, they would head for the Stargate and the next job. Captain Baker had wished him luck and given Terry a computer chip with some data to study on ship's computer systems. Baker thought he might make a good ship's computer officer someday. Terry took the data, of course, but he had no interest in being a ship's officer. Space was cool enough, sure. However, after half a year floating around the cosmos, he didn't think he'd want to do it for the rest of his life. The submersible sealed up, and everyone managed to find a place to sit. Terry got to stay up front and had a view out of the super-dense plastic windows as they dove under the waves. It was an alien-manufactured vessel and looked quite high-tech. They maneuvered out of the submarine pen and out into the open. Then Honcho programmed the vessel and it began its long, long dive. Doc's watch beeped and he looked at it. "Midnight," he said. "Merry Christmas." "Oh, right," Terry's mom said. "I'd almost forgotten." She looked at Terry and frowned. "I'm sorry. I wasn't able to get you anything this year." "That's okay," he said. "At least we're together." She looked at Doc and they both nodded. Dozens of people were crowded in the back and someone sang The First Noel. Soon they were all singing along as best they could. Terry watched out the big windows. The sublights were on and he saw they were passing the orcas, slowly circling down into the night. The sub hummed with the sounds of singing. Outside, the orcas seemed to be singing as well. Terry's translator didn't render any of it into English except one word, shul. As they descended into the abyss, the whale's song provided a mournful counterpoint to the hymns. Part 3, Exile, Chapter 1, Hoarfrost, Lupasha System, Koro Region, Tolo Arm, January 4th, 2038. Terry rolled over in his bunk and stretched. After a week, his joints no longer ached with every movement. Unlike the cetaceans, the humans hadn't been getting treatments to live at the extreme depths of their new home. Their bodies weren't designed to live at such depths. Orcas had been observed to dive more than 300 meters. That was nothing compared to the 2,000 meters of ice over their heads. "I wish the place didn't smell like rotten fish," he said as his feet hit the deck. As usual, it was cold. He was always cold. After a lifetime in Molokai and always being warm, he thought they should have named the place Hell. He'd learned in school that the Vikings believed in a frozen hell, not a hot one. Made sense if you lived in the icy north. The room's lights came on to show the stark gray walls. He had his own room again, 28.8 cubic meters of opulence. His bunk, a little desk, a chair, and a toilet that wasn't shaped for his butt. The toilet also converted into a shower, but it only sprayed cold water. He went into the bathroom and washed up a bit, brushed his teeth, and used the toilet. The mirror was a highly polished piece of stainless steel. It worked well enough. One level down, and he was in the mess hall. The sun wasn't visible to them, so day and night cycles had been established to match what they'd been used to on Molokai. Since it was breakfast time, the place was crowded. Conversations bubbled all around, some quiet, some loud. A few laughed, a couple cried. Adjusting to the pressure was a personal process. Not everyone experienced it the same way. His mom came in and made her way over to him, standing in the food line. She was smiling, which got his attention. "What's up?" he asked. "They got the first set of heaters working." "Oh, thank God," he said. "When?" She pointed up, and he tracked her gesture. A series of fabric tubes the engineers had strung the day they arrived, in the hopes the heating system worked as planned, had sat unmoving for days. As if her gesture was the cue, they began to billow, then stiffened. The first breeze of warm air blew across his face. All around the room, people looked up, some in confusion, many in amazement. They all wore just about every piece of clothing they had with them in order to keep warm. The habitat's atmosphere processing and basic power systems created enough heat to keep it from being freezing inside, but nobody in their right mind would call 10 degrees Celsius warm. They'd also been sleeping in shiny reflective space blankets to keep warm. "Warm air!" someone yelled. A wave of applause rippled across the room, which quickly grew to loud cheering and then a standing ovation. Terry's mom patted him on the shoulder and walked up to the front of the room where a low stage sat. The mess hall was also their meeting room, currently. When the people saw her, they fell silent. "The staff hasn't had much sleep the last week," she said, "as I'm sure you all know." The door opened and 3 people walked in, all looking oily and tired. I think we owe Melissa and her men a round of applause. The 3 new arrivals stopped in their tracks as everyone in the room applauded them, many yelling their thanks. The leader, Melissa, waved her hands to stop the applause. "This is just the start," she said. "We have the power transfers working properly now, so we'll have all the rest of the regular support systems working in short order." More applause. "But first, we'd like some food and some sleep." "It feels so good," Terry said when she rejoined him. It was already warm enough that many were removing some of their extra layers. Terry set aside one of the 2 jackets he'd been wearing. "It sure does," she agreed. "You get any food yet?" "Still waking up," he said, and yawned. "How do you feel?" Terry flexed his arms and nodded. "Better," he said. She nodded and flexed her own arms. "Me too. In fact, everyone seems to be getting there." Their nominal medical staff had done everything they could to accelerate the acclimation process, but mostly it involved letting people adjust. Each day the pressure had gotten higher until they were the equivalent of 1 kilometer down. Science had figured out how to allow people to acclimate much deeper, though it would take months. Coming up would be just as hard. The pressure would now only increase a few psi per day. "Any luck with the rotten fish smell?" he asked. "They found a scent dispersal system," she said. "You mean it stinks on purpose?" he asked. She nodded. They'd thought there must be a huge cache of rotten fish left behind by the Selroth. Now it looked like they liked the smell and had done it on purpose. "They've turned one off, but there must be another." Luckily for everyone, they'd brought their own auto chefs and supplies. The food was at least pretty good, even if some of the prepackaged stuff had imploded the previous day. Afterward, the cooks had taken measures to prevent any more losses until they could get local food processing properly. After he'd eaten, he got up. "I have to go check on Pokale," he said. "Dr. Janig says he's doing fine," she said. "Yeah, he's used to the feeding system. Little guy just misses me." "Don't forget, class is this afternoon." Terry rolled his eyes. "Be there, young man." "Fine," he said, and left. His mother yelled something after him, but Terry pretended not to hear her. Leaving the mess hall, he went down 2 levels to the main floor, where he could see the dome. Their entire habitat was built inside a dome made from a single piece of ruby formed by the Islians deep inside a gas giant. The technicians explained it was a molecular matrix that would handle almost any pressure difference. Regardless, it was hard to believe the water pushing on it was over 100 kilograms per square centimeter. "One tiny crack," he said, looking at the dome. Even so, the view was worth it. Thousands of lights were placed all around the dome at regular intervals, providing light during daytime hours. By projecting the light out, the brilliantly illuminated water created a more natural glow in the dome's interior. Outside, a pair of orcas swam past, too far away for Terry to tell who it might be. In addition, a dizzying array of native fish swam everywhere. The native fish were blind, never having evolved eyes 2 kilometers under the ice. Instead, they possessed many varied ways of sensing their environment. These ranged from incredibly delicate pressure sensors on many, including the larger predators, to feelers. Many of the plant-eating fish sported a fan of ridiculously long feelers that reminded Terry of a mustache, used to find plant life among the many common volcanic vents. The dome was built on the flattened top of an extinct undersea volcano. It was within 100 meters of the ice, which extended for 2 kilometers above their heads. The melt shaft another 100 meters to the side. They weren't directly under the shaft, so if an accident happened, it wouldn't sink directly onto the dome, which wasn't indestructible. As they were still working to get the habitat fully operational, the mines weren't yet a priority. They were scattered all around the habitat in every direction at varying depths, from a few 100 meters below them to several kilometers. Inside the dome, their habitat was a series of buildings, varying from the 5-story living quarters he was just leaving to the 10-story administrative and control systems building whose roof met the top center of the dome. Several smaller buildings were dotted around as well. He was heading for the one tasked as cetacean care, a 2-story sprawling building with one of the habitat's 3 locks. As he walked to the building, he passed a bunch of kids playing a kickball game. They were all younger and seemed oblivious to both the view and the fact that they were under the ice on an alien moon. They were just happy to be off the starships and to have ground under their feet, even if it was volcanic stone. The group noticed him and waved. Somehow he'd become famous among the children. The Cetacean Care Building, dubbed the CC, was where Dr. Janig had set up. As their sole cetacean-qualified physician, he was also their main human doctor. Since he was forced to wear 2 hats, he wanted to be closer to those who would need him more. The doors to the building were open, though a sign proclaimed, "The doctor is out." Dr. Janig had a staff of 5 others, 2 fully trained medical techs and 3 nurses, one of whom was learning to be a doctor. Terry knew the medical staff was one of their biggest concerns. Terry went in and through the small waiting area into the back of the first floor, where Dr. Janig had his office. The physician looked up and smiled when he saw who his visitor was. "Good morning, Mr. Clark," he said. Being called Mr. made Terry feel strange. His father was Mr. Clark. "Morning, Dr. Janig. How are your patients?" "They're fine," he said. "The robot feeder is doing its job, and the cetaceans are continuing to eat their way through everything they can find that swims." Despite being thousands of meters under the ice, hoarfrost had evolved a wide variety of marine life. Most of it was various plants feeding off large amounts of nutrients ejected from deep-sea vents, tiny animals feeding on those, and on up. The largest aquatic animal was a dinosaur-looking fish a meter long, which fed on smaller dinosaur-looking fish, at least until the Cellroth had come along. Terry caught movement out of the corner of his eye. One entire wall of the building was constructed against the ruby dome. Outside, one of the flute flashed into view. It smashed into the wall and ricocheted off at an angle. No sound of the impact passed through the super-hard ruby wall. The flute was classified as closest to the genus Chelonia, the green turtle, except the flute had 6 flippers and a long, flexible neck which could retreat into the shell, and a flippered tail for extra power. A second after the flute swam away, one of the orcas appeared in hot pursuit. Dr. Janig shook his head and made a note in one of his slates. "They haven't figured out how to eat the flutes yet, but they keep trying." Hunting the native life proved easy, since they were all blind. The flute had been imported by the Cellroth. Apparently they'd brought their own sea creatures for food and amusement. The marine biologists had been horrified to learn this fact, saying the damage to the biosphere was probably irreversible. Dr. Patel was working on a study of the various Cellroth species they'd encountered. He'd assembled a list from the Galnet of creatures from the aliens' home world and was marking them off as each was located. To this point, they hadn't seen an uhobo, a large predatory species native to the Cellroth planet. Terry looked at some of the Tri-V displayed details on Cellroth marine species, noting their eyes shared similar characteristics, silvery with red rims and 2 irises. A strange and cool evolutionary adaptation. Another of Dr. Janig's Tri-Vs was showing a dissected local fish with descriptions pointing to various parts and organs. Terry could hear Dr. Patel's voice speaking as the dissection proceeded. "Have they brought in any new fish today?" he asked. "One of the bottlenoses Hula did a few hours ago. It was chewed up a bit, though." He gestured to a table, and Terry went over to look at it. "It's got legs," he said. "Looks like it," Dr. Janig said. "Not my specialty. Patel will look at it this afternoon." The scientist glanced over at another slate. "You going to handle feeding Pokale?" "Yes," Terry said. Dr. Janig nodded and went back to watching the video and putting bits of fish into test tubes. Terry walked through several doors and down a corridor to the lock area. Of the city's 3 locks, only 2 were currently working. One of them was the submarine bay, which was still slowly transporting equipment down from the surface at the rate of 1 trip a day. The other was in CC and acted as the center of all underwater operations. As soon as he entered the moon pool room, he saw Doc and his crew were already there. "Hey, guys," he said. "What's up, kiddo?" Doc asked, glancing up from their project. All 7 mercs were working on a series of big robots hanging from frameworks. They hadn't been there yesterday. "Robots?" he asked. "Not quite," Doc said. "We'll show you soon." "Oh, come on." "Chill, kid," Honcho said, flipping up a welding mask to glance at him. "Yeah," Hutch said. He and Peyton weren't helping much. They were playing cards, as usual. "You never said if you'll be leaving for any other contracts," Terry said, hoping to change course and keep his eyes on what they were doing. "Not sure yet," Doc said, while looking at a slate Terry couldn't see. "Going to take us 3 days to decompress from here," Tina said, and shrugged. "Plus we have to rely on passive comms, so nobody knows we're here." "Go feed the fish, kid," Toothpick said, gesturing with his head toward the moon pool. Reluctantly, Terry turned and headed over toward the moon pool. He glanced back once, but still couldn't see anything. "What the heck are they working on?" he thought. He reached the pool, and Pokale immediately surfaced and chirped at him. "Hey, buddy," Terry said. "How you doing?" The young orca bobbed his head up and down quickly. He'd become much more expressive in the last few weeks before arriving on Hoarfrost, though Terry could tell he also missed his mom. A movement drew his attention, and he saw Moloko floating just outside the lock. She had part of a dead sea creature and was playing with it. The life was so abundant around their habitat, the colonists were eating the stores put back for the cetaceans because they didn't need it. Terry touched the transmit on his translator. "Good morning, Moloko." Morning, Warden Terry, she replied. How Pokale? He is fine, but misses you. Terry took the ready bottle, and the calf greedily drank. How now soon? 9 days, Terry said, after checking his slate to be sure. The pressure equalization was slower because of the humans, which is hard for the cetaceans to understand. Where are the rest of the orcas? He asked. They go. Where? Explore. Oh, he said. This was the first he'd heard about them exploring. What are they looking for? Shul! They're looking for their god, Terry thought. How are they looking? Call into deep. Wait. Listen. Have they heard anything back? Not yet. An hour later, he was finished with Pokale and headed back out. Doc and his people were nowhere in sight, and neither was their project. He made a face as he casually looked around the equipment bay, only finding random tools and testing equipment. He must have still been scowling a few minutes later when he ran into his mom as he was heading toward the classroom area. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, he lied. She gave him her stern mom face. The orcas are looking for their god, and Doc and the guys are up to something and won't tell me what. As for their god, that's up to them, she said, and shrugged. Dr. Orsage thinks it's therapeutic for them, being isolated from the sky and earth. I guess that makes sense, Terry agreed. Yeah, it's probably harmless. As for Doc and his guys hiding things from you, how horrible, she said with a smile, which did nothing to reduce his saltiness. Everyone says I'm important. Why are they keeping secrets from me? Only a couple get to know everything going on, and I'm sorry to say you aren't one of them. He looked down, embarrassed. You're a huge help, but you don't have to know everything. You're not old enough to be responsible. I know, he said, feeling like a grade school kid. As one of those who knows everything going on, I can guarantee you'll be quite excited by what the guys are working on. He brightened up, hoping she was about to spill the beans. That said, aren't you going to be late for your first class? He checked his watch. She was right. Class started in 5 minutes. Yeah, he said. Get going. You'll find out soon enough. She continued in the direction she'd been heading. All right, that is the end of our reading for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please give us a like and subscribe and share with your friends. We'll see you again in a few days.